From Mexico to India, world powers are now trading through Ottawa, not Washington. The era of American dominance.
It's official. 11 countries just rewrote the trade map. And the U.S. isn't even in the room. That's the headline flashing across global newsrooms this morning. Behind closed doors in Ottawa last week, Canadian officials signed a sweeping new series of trade agreements, some confidential, some leaked, and the shockwave was immediate. Markets tumbled. White House aides scrambled for answers. And for the first time in decades, the world isn't calling Washington first, they're dialing Ottawa. One country cutting ties is a shift. 2 is a trend. But 11? This isn't just a trade update. It's a revolt. Number 1. America's closest neighbor, and now its fastest deserter. For over a century, Mexico and the United States built a bond that defined North American trade. From Detroit's car factories to Monterrey's steel mills, this was the heart of the continent's economic engine. But in August 2025, the engine stalled. And when it did, Mexico didn't wait. The trigger? A series of sweeping U.S. tariffs on steel, agriculture, and even lithium key resources that Mexico depends on for exports. In a bid to protect American manufacturing, Washington hiked duties by 18%, blindsiding its southern ally. Mexico retaliated. It retaliated with silence and a quiet redirection of loyalty. Within weeks, Canadian diplomats arrived in Mexico City. Unlike the combative tone from D.C., Ottawa came with a different message: partnership, respect, and stability. What they offered wasn't just economic. It was political dignity. And Mexico listened. By mid-September, Canada and Mexico finalized a new bilateral pact. Zero tariffs on agricultural goods, preferential rail access through Alberta to Vancouver, and, most importantly, joint development in lithium processing for EV batteries. Mexico's president called it a trade agreement for the future. Washington called it something else: betrayal. But was it? Really? For Mexico, this shift wasn't personal. It was survival. U.S. unpredictability had reached a breaking point. In contrast, Canada's trade strategy was calm, calculated, and consistent. And that's what business needs. Already, Mexican avocado shipments are rerouting through Canadian logistics hubs in British Columbia. Canada has fast-tracked 12 new customs stations along the Pacific Rail Line to accommodate surging freight. And lithium? Alberta's mining companies are now working directly with Mexican suppliers, skipping the U.S. middleman entirely. In just 6 weeks, a century of trade gravity tilted north. But here's what's worse for the U.S. This isn't just an economic loss. It's symbolic. If even Mexico, the neighbor that built NAFTA with America, can walk away, who's next? Number 2. Chile, a nation rich in minerals, poor in patience. For years, the U.S. considered Chile one of its most stable trade partners in South America. Copper, lithium, and fruit flowed north. Machinery and chemicals flowed south. On paper, it was a win-win. But paper burns fast in a political storm. In April 2025, the U.S. quietly pulled out of a multilateral deal that would have lowered tariffs on Chilean produce and raw materials. Citing national industrial security, the White House prioritized domestic mining interests, leaving Chile exposed and humiliated. That's when Canada stepped in, not with loud promises, but with a plan. By May, Ottawa had sent a full delegation to Santiago. They didn't arrive with demands. They arrived with listening ears, environmental cooperation plans, and most importantly, full tariff elimination on lithium exports to Canada. And Chile didn't hesitate. They flipped. Within 2 months, Canadian energy companies had inked long-term extraction contracts with Chile's largest lithium mines in Atacama. In return, Chile gained access to Canadian AI and automation tech to modernize its ports and mining facilities. The pivot sent shockwaves through Washington, not just because of what Chile did, but because of how quietly they did it. No press conference, No warning. Just a new signature on a new deal, without the US even in the room. And the consequences were immediate. American battery makers, who relied heavily on Chilean lithium, saw their supply chains disrupted. Prices spiked. Contracts stalled. Factories slowed down. Meanwhile, Canada's EV sector boomed. With lithium now flowing steadily from South America, provinces like Ontario and Quebec began scaling up gigafactory production. Tesla Canada expanded. Rivian Canada launched. And the kicker? Chile's president, in a rare televised address, said this: Chile needs consistency, not chaos. And today, consistency comes from Canada. That line hit harder in DC than any official sanction. Because beneath the polite language, the message was clear. Chile didn't leave America out of rage. Chile left because America stopped showing up. Number 3. Indonesia. Southeast Asia's sleeping giant just made a wide-awake move. With over 270 million people and a rapidly industrializing economy, Indonesia has long been courted by major powers. The US saw it as a strategic ally, especially for shipping lanes and defense cooperation. But in trade, the relationship was shaky. For years, US companies hesitated to invest long-term. Shifting policies, inconsistent tariffs, and rigid visa restrictions made Indonesia feel more like a project than a partner. Then came the final straw. In early 2025, the US abruptly suspended a renewable energy grant to Jakarta, citing compliance concerns. What the headlines didn't say: the delay left dozens of solar and hydro projects in limbo and thousands of workers without pay. Canada noticed, and unlike Washington, Ottawa didn't lecture it invested. By March, Canada's Trade Ministry had signed a $3.2 billion green infrastructure package with Indonesia. Solar grids in West Java, geothermal plants in Sumatra, and most critically joint ownership agreements, not colonial-style contracts. For Indonesia, that distinction mattered. They weren't being used for resources. They were being trusted as equals. And the payoff came fast. In June 2025, Indonesia announced a new logistics pact that rerouted 45% of its palm oil and rubber exports away from US ports and into Canadian hands. Simultaneously, Canadian firms like Brookfield and Hydro One opened new regional offices in Jakarta and Bali. For the first time ever, Indonesia publicly stated it would deprioritize US trade deals in favor of sustainable sovereign-first agreements with partners like Canada. It was a quiet rejection, but one with loud consequences. Shipping reports in the Strait of Malacca began to show a steady decline in US-flagged containers heading to Jakarta. Canadian carriers, however, up 37% in just 4 months. Meanwhile, American think tanks scrambled to understand how they lost the 4th largest country in the world without a single shot fired. The answer, again, was in a line buried in Indonesia's own ministry press release. Canada speaks with partnership. The US speaks with conditions. One sentence, one shift. And just like that, a massive Asian economy reoriented itself northward. Not because of power, but because of predictability. Number 4. Saudi Arabia. America's crown jewel in the Middle East just handed its refinery key to Canada. For nearly 80 years, US-Saudi relations were built on a simple pact: oil for protection. America secured the kingdom militarily. Saudi Arabia kept the energy flowing. It wasn't a friendship, it was a transaction, but one that worked until it didn't. In February 2025, tensions quietly erupted behind closed doors. The US had just passed a new Energy Sovereignty Act, requiring that all imported crude be certified under aggressive environmental benchmarks that Saudi officials privately called insulting and impossible. Riyadh viewed it not as policy, but punishment, and they responded with something far more devastating than a press release. They picked up the phone and called Ottawa. What happened next was swift secret, and seismic. By April, Canada and Saudi Arabia had reached a confidential energy transition deal, brokered in Geneva, that shocked analysts. The terms? Saudi crude would be directly routed to Canada's Atlantic refineries in New Brunswick and Newfoundland, bypassing the U.S. entirely. In exchange, Canadian companies would invest $1.8 billion in Saudi solar and hydrogen tech, part of the kingdom's ambitious 2030 energy diversification plan. But the real headline? Canada agreed to dual-price shielding, protecting Saudi exports from carbon taxes through a joint emissions trading framework. Translation: Saudi Arabia just found a new best friend, one that didn't try to control the rules. And it didn't take long for the U.S. to feel it. Gas prices spiked along the East Coast as Atlantic refineries adjusted to new Canadian-Saudi priority routes. Tanker traffic in the Gulf of Mexico dropped by 22%, and oil futures in Houston began to reflect a chilling truth. America wasn't first in line anymore. Then came the final blow. In a closed-door OPEC Plus meeting in Vienna, Saudi Arabia's energy minister looked across the table at his American counterpart and reportedly said, "We're not cutting ties. We're just exploring reliability." And right now, Ottawa answers the phone faster than Washington. Diplomatic, yes, but unmistakably clear. Saudi Arabia didn't abandon America out of anger. They did it out of exhaustion. For decades, they tolerated U.S. mood swings in exchange for market access. But in a world shifting toward multipolar energy alliances, Riyadh isn't betting on loyalty. They're betting on leverage. And right now, Canada's playbook is winning. Number 5. Vietnam. The rising tiger of Southeast Asia just leapt west, but not toward Washington. For over a decade, U.S. companies flooded into Vietnam, chasing cheap labor and fast growth. Nike, Intel, and Apple all expanded their presence, turning cities like Ho Chi Minh and Da Nang into modern supply chain hubs. But in 2025, the tone changed. Washington's new Strategic Origin Act demanded that any country receiving U.S. investment must align with American foreign policy standards, particularly around trade with China and military neutrality. Vietnam, fiercely proud of its independence, saw the move not as strategy, but as subtle coercion. And it didn't take long for that pride to become policy. Just 2 months later, Vietnam signed a regional logistics pact with Canada that stunned the West. The deal gave Canadian freight priority access at key ports like Haiphong and Cat Lai, while also expanding cold chain infrastructure for seafood exports, a sector where Vietnam dominates. Canada, in turn, dropped all import quotas on Vietnamese textiles, electronics, and agricultural goods. And most importantly, it offered technology-sharing agreements, something Washington had repeatedly refused to do. It wasn't just a trade deal. It was recognition. For Vietnam, Canada's approach checked all the boxes. No political interference, mutual economic benefit, and quiet respect. And the impact was immediate. Vietnam's Ministry of Industry redirected 28% of outgoing exports once earmarked for the U.S. to Canadian distributors instead. Warehouses in Vancouver and Montreal began filling with Vietnamese-made phones, shoes, and frozen shrimp. And in the background, Vietnamese business leaders gave off the record interviews calling the U.S. erratic, demanding, and unreliable. American diplomats scrambled to patch things up, offering new incentives and tech packages. But the damage was already done. Vietnam had discovered an alternative partner, one that didn't treat every negotiation like a loyalty test. In a televised interview in July, Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister delivered a message that landed like a slap in Washington. "We don't need a big brother. We need a partner." And Canada understands that. In thinking the dat hand and dat had in this come, the crest of on the sense of airy setter. For a country that had survived colonization, war, and great power games, Vietnam wasn't picking sides. It was picking stability. And in 2025, stability wears a maple leaf. Number 6. Brazil. the agricultural titan that just shook America's farm belt to its core. For decades, Brazil and the US have fought a quiet battle over who feeds the world. From soybeans to beef, ethanol to corn syrup, each year was a tug-of-war for market share in Europe, Asia, and beyond. But until 2025, there was an unspoken rule: never cut each other out completely. That rule just died. In July 2025, Brazil's government announced a massive new agricultural export alliance, not with Washington, but with Ottawa. On paper, it looked simple: a joint initiative for sustainable farming practices, preferential rail access through Canadian ports, tech support from Canadian firms for climate-resilient crop systems. But buried deep in the fine print was the true headline: Brazil would begin phasing out all U.S. agro-import dependencies by Q1 2026. That included machinery, fertilizers, crop insurance systems, and even agro-finance platforms that had long been dominated by American giants like John Deere and Cargill. In their place, Canadian firms like AG Growth International, Nutrien, and Farm Credit Canada. And while the U.S. was still digesting that blow, Brazil delivered a second punch. They canceled 2 major soybean contracts with U.S. exporters worth nearly $700 million and reallocated the quotas to Canadian suppliers, despite the higher shipping costs. Why? Because for Brazil, it wasn't about distance anymore. It was about predictability. Canada's agtech was advanced, its environmental policies aligned with Brazil's own goals, and most importantly, it wasn't laced with political baggage. An anonymous Brazilian trade official summed it up in a single line: with Canada, we plan 10 years ahead. With the US, we check Twitter every morning. It was harsh, but it was true. America's unpredictable sanctions, tariffs, and sudden reversals had exhausted Brazilian policymakers. Deals were getting harder to finalize, contracts kept getting renegotiated, trust eroded. And so Brazil flipped. Canadian ports in Halifax and Prince Rupert began handling record amounts of South American grain. Joint carbon trade platforms were rolled out between Sao Paulo and Ottawa. And in a twist no one saw coming, Brazil invited Canadian inspectors to participate in its national food certification process, a role previously held by U.S. agencies. That symbolic gesture told the whole story. Brazil didn't just adjust a few deals. It rewired its entire supply chain to make sure it never had to depend on Washington again. Number 7. Turkey. A wild card in NATO, but now a wild card holder in global trade. For decades, U.S. relations with Turkey were transactional at best, volatile at worst. Arms deals, sanctions, airbase negotiations, it was never simple. But behind the political noise, one thing quietly endured: strong trade. The U.S. remained Turkey's second largest trading partner, especially in tech, agriculture, and defense-related goods. And Washington always assumed that would remain true even if the politics got messy. But in 2025, that assumption collapsed. It started with a simple review of tariffs. Turkey's Ministry of Trade concluded that U.S. import duties on Turkish steel and textiles, some of which had lingered since the Trump era, were still quietly draining the economy by nearly $1.2 billion per year. They sent a formal request to Washington for revision. No response. For 8 weeks, American trade representatives offered vague promises, but no real change. Meanwhile, Turkish inflation ticked up, exports slowed, and factories in Bursa and Gaziantep began feeling the pain. And then Canada showed up. In a surprise move, Canada's Minister of Trade visited Ankara with a radical proposal: scrap the legacy tariffs, start fresh, and build a new trade corridor through the Black Sea. Turkey listened, and for once, they didn't hedge. In May 2025, Turkey signed a comprehensive trade reset agreement with Canada that broke almost every precedent. A joint shipping route between the Turkish port of Samsun and Canadian Atlantic terminals. A tariff-free textile exchange, which immediately boosted Turkish garment exports by 28%. Canadian military tech components allowed limited access into Turkish defense manufacturing, with export restrictions but no political strings. And the most unexpected clause? A new arbitration framework that allowed Turkey to bypass US and dominated trade courts and settle disputes directly with Canada under a neutral system. This wasn't just a new trade deal. It was Turkey rewriting the rules and writing America out of the chapter. Almost overnight, Turkish business leaders pulled back from US suppliers. Contracts were rerouted. Even simple components like circuit boards, once imported from Michigan, were replaced by Canadian equivalents. And in Istanbul's business district, the whispers were loud. The US is all politics. Canada is all business. Washington didn't even issue a formal complaint. The State Department was too focused on other crises: Ukraine, Taiwan, oil volatility, but economists noticed. Loudly. By August, US-Turkey trade had dropped 19%. Canadian-Turkey trade, up 42%. And Turkish officials hinted that more shifts were coming, possibly in aviation, pharma, and AI infrastructure. For the first time in years, Ankara wasn't reacting to American pressure. They were choosing partners that respected sovereignty and avoided theatrics. And in 2025, that meant Canada. Number 8. Australia, one of America's most reliable allies, now quietly realigning its supply chain without saying a word. For generations, the US-Australia relationship was cast in iron. ANZUS alliance, Five Eyes intelligence sharing, and billions in mutual trade. Washington never worried about Canberra. It was the friend who'd always show up. But in 2025, Australia stopped calling back. There was no press conference, no dramatic walkout. Just small signals, barely noticeable at first. U.S. agriculture delegations canceled without rescheduling. Tech summits skipped odd. Investment projects closed, paused for review, and then came the data. Between March and July 2025, Australian imports of American machinery and processed food dropped by 31%. In contrast, Canadian imports to Australia surged, especially in clean tech, wheat, and consumer packaging. What changed? A quiet internal audit by Australia's Department of Trade concluded that U.S. delivery delays, volatile pricing, and diplomatic unpredictability were becoming long-term risks. And while the U.S. was busy trying to reindustrialize, Canada was simply showing up on time. Canadian exporters, particularly in British Columbia and Manitoba, were offering stable contracts, faster shipping through the Pacific, and, crucially, no political baggage. By May, several large Australian retailers, including supermarket giants and construction supply chains, renegotiated core contracts with Canadian partners, ditching long-standing U.S. vendors. And the shift didn't stop there. Australia's Ministry of Infrastructure signed a deal to import Canadian prefabricated modular housing kits for disaster relief and rural development, bypassing American timber and steel firms. Then, in perhaps the most telling move, Australian LNG firms began favoring Canadian pipeline technologies over U.S. ones, citing better environmental compliance and more flexible financing terms. No drama, no denouncements, just one of America's most loyal friends, slowly walking away. When asked about the shift during a Sydney press briefing, one official offered only this: "Our goal is reliable supply, and we go where the supply is reliable." It wasn't a betrayal. It was a quiet divorce, filed without noise, finalized without resistance. By the time Washington noticed, Australian ports were already filled with Canadian cargo. And perhaps the most sobering part for America? Australia didn't leave out of anger. They left out of disappointment. Number 9. The United Arab Emirates. Once the jewel of U.S. influence in the Gulf, now cutting multi-billion-dollar deals in Ottawa, not Washington. For 2 decades, the U.S. was the undisputed trade partner for the UAE. Military hardware, aviation tech, agri-imports, luxury real estate investment. It was all routed through the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. But by 2025, a quiet shift had begun. Not in politics, but in tone. The U.S. began insisting on value-aligned trade. New clauses around labor rights, arms transfer conditions, and environmental compliance suddenly complicated decades-old contracts. For the UAE, it felt like a lecture. And they don't do lectures. Meanwhile, Canada came with a smile and a spreadsheet. Canadian delegations didn't talk about politics. They talked logistics, faster delivery of agricultural equipment, AI-powered airport infrastructure systems, fintech platforms for sovereign fund optimization. In April 2025, a UAE trade envoy landed in Toronto for what was expected to be a routine exploration meeting. It turned into a strategic pivot. By June, the UAE and Canada had signed 3 major trade memorandums. 1. A $2.4 billion rupees smart logistics hub co-financed by Canadian tech firms and Dubai's DP World. R. A clean energy investment framework, enabling co-ownership of solar infrastructure in Alberta. 3. A rare dual currency financing channel, allowing direct dirham Canadian dollar transactions, cutting the US dollar out of the equation entirely. Washington was blindsided, and it got worse. For years, the UAE's national airline, Etihad Airways, had sourced parts and avionics from US aerospace firms. But in mid-2025, they announced a new supplier rotation program, with Canadian firms like CAE and Bombardier taking over major contracts. By July, Etihad's newest fleet expansion was backed not by Boeing, but by a Canadian-European hybrid financing package. The symbolism was brutal. US headlines barely covered it. But in Ottawa and Abu Dhabi, it was understood. The UAE hadn't just diversified, it had reprioritized. And for Canada, this wasn't about volume, it was about status. They were now sitting at tables once reserved exclusively for Washington. Tables where billion-dollar deals were made. When asked during a press conference about the new direction, a UAE economic advisor said, "We admire efficiency, discretion, and reliability. Canada offers all 3. And then came the final twist. Canada was invited to observer-level talks at the UAE-hosted MENA Investment Roundtable, an honor previously extended only to Washington, London, and Brussels. Canada didn't just join the room, it replaced the US in it. Number 10. France. Not a trade rival, not a geopolitical enemy, but a long-standing ally, quietly stepping back from America's shadow. No fireworks, no scandal, just a strategic silence that now speaks volumes. For decades, France and the US traded more than goods. They traded ideals, liberty, diplomacy, and transatlantic cooperation. But lately, that relationship has strained under the weight of conflicting economic visions. In 2024, the US introduced a set of democratic trade standards, requiring allies to follow strict compliance benchmarks on digital privacy, labor reform, and supply chain surveillance if they wanted access to expanded US benchmarks. Markets. France pushed back politely at first, then firmly. Paris didn't appreciate being lectured. And more importantly, French businesses didn't like being delayed. So in 2025, French officials made a quiet move. They began negotiating a parallel trade channel with Canada, outside of NATO, outside of G7 frameworks, and away from Washington's oversight. The result? By May, France and Canada launched a joint green manufacturing pact, linking Quebec's clean energy sector with French EV and battery producers. The deal bypassed American suppliers entirely. Then came logistics. France's Port Authority signed a transatlantic routing agreement with Halifax and Montreal, reducing reliance on congested East Coast U.S. ports. And in June, a major French pharmaceutical firm previously partnered with a California supplier relocated its API supply contracts to Toronto and Edmonton. The reason? Lower volatility, more consistent trade terms, less drama. It wasn't just about business. It was a reputation shift. France was no longer seeing America as a default leader. It was looking north for calm, clear-eyed cooperation. And Canadian diplomacy played it perfectly. Rather than boasting, Ottawa moved in quiet coordination. No press spectacle. No headlines screaming, "France ditches the US." Just spreadsheets, legal teams, and handshake after handshake behind closed doors. By July, the French Minister for Industry stated on record, "We continue to value our partnership with the United States, but our growth strategy must remain agile and diverse. Canada offers such a path." In DC, officials shrugged it off. But in Brussels and Berlin, ears perked up. Because when France steps back, others in Europe often follow. The US may still be the biggest player at the table, but France just picked a different tablecloth, and Canada helped set it. Number 11. India. The world's most populous democracy, the fastest growing major economy, and now the most painful loss for US trade dominance. For years, Washington poured energy into courting New Delhi defense pacts, technology transfers, summits with prime ministers. On paper, everything looked solid. But underneath, there was friction. American firms often complained about Indian bureaucracy, while Indian officials lamented US unpredictability. A growing list of grievances piled up. Visa restrictions for Indian engineers, delays in semiconductor tech approvals, ongoing disputes over digital sovereignty, and most recently a collapsed clean energy fund Washington had promised but never delivered. Then came Canada. Quiet, ready, strategic. Ottawa didn't offer speeches. It offered timelines. Didn't criticize Delhi's internal policies, just respected them. And in May 2025, it paid off. India and Canada signed what's now being called the Global Stability Corridor Agreement, a massive trade and infrastructure framework that shocked the US State Department. Highlights: A. Shesh. 5. B. Canadian investment in Indian semiconductor manufacturing in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. Joint agricultural R&D centers focused on climate-resilient farming. A landmark fintech agreement allowing direct rupee-Canadian dollar exchanges for cross-border trade. But the most symbolic move? India delisted the US from its Tier 1 preferred technology import list, a ranking that once guaranteed priority access for American exporters. Canada was now in that spot. America was out, and the consequences were swift. Within weeks, India halted negotiations on 2 key deals with US cloud providers and aerospace suppliers. Those contracts were quietly rerouted to firms in Vancouver and Toronto. Several US delegations had meetings postponed or flatly canceled. By July, US semiconductor executives were sounding alarms on Capitol Hill, warning that they were being boxed out of the Indian market by Canadian diplomacy. That won a very pram. Meanwhile, Indian media began praising Canada as the future-proof partner, a nation willing to collaborate, not dictate. In one fiery editorial, the Times of India wrote, "America's tone is imperial. Canada's tone is intentional. India prefers the latter." That line was quoted in multiple G20 meetings. The White House issued a formal statement calling India's shift disappointing. But behind closed doors, it was far more than that. It was a strategic catastrophe. India wasn't just a customer. It was a pillar of future tech trade, a swing state in the Indo-Pacific, a $3.7 trillion economy now leaning into a northbound trade axis that bypassed the US completely. And this wasn't just about business. It was about symbolism. If India closes the door, others will wonder if America still holds the key. 11 nations, 11 exits, and just one message: America is no longer the default. From Asia to the Middle East, countries aren't protesting, they're pivoting. They're signing with Canada, quietly, steadily, permanently. Not because they hate the US, but because they no longer trust it. Canada didn't shout. It just showed up reliable, calm, consistent. And now, the trade routes are shifting. The contracts are changing. And the US isn't even in the room. So here's the real question. When even your closest friends start choosing someone else, how long before you realize you've already been replaced?